Imagine you work for the United States government. It is 1962. The Cold War is at its most dangerous. Nuclear weapons are pointed at American cities, and your boss walks into a meeting and places a document on the table. A document written in calm, official language, proposing that the United States military should fake terrorist attacks on American soil, shoot down its own planes, sink its own ships, stage the deaths of American citizens, not to cause chaos, to blame Cuba for it, and use that manufactured outrage to justify going to war. This was not a conspiracy theory. This was not a rumor. This was a real document, signed by real generals, submitted through official channels to the Secretary of Defense of the United States. It was called Operation Northwoods, and for nearly 40 years, almost no one knew it existed. On New Year's Day, 1959, the old order in Cuba collapsed. Fulgencio Batista, the island's longtime strongman, fled Havana before dawn. By the time the sun rose, radio stations were broadcasting the news. The revolution had won. Fidel Castro, still in his olive fatigues, entered the capital a week later, on January 8th. He was greeted by crowds in the streets, some hopeful, some wary, all aware that history had changed overnight. Washington watched closely. At first, there was caution, not hostility. On January 2nd, the U.S. State Department advised recognizing the new government, calling it free from communist influence. American officials wanted stability, not chaos, just 90 miles off the Florida coast. But uncertainty lingered. Who was Castro? What did he want? Would Cuba remain an independent neighbor or become a Soviet outpost in the Caribbean? The answers came quickly. Within a year, Castro's government began seizing foreign assets. American-owned sugar mills, oil refineries, and factories were nationalized. Compensation was promised but never paid. U.S. business interests evaporated almost overnight. The economic break drove the new Cuban regime to seek support elsewhere, and the Soviet Union was eager to step in. By 1960, Soviet ships were docking in Havana's ports. Soviet aid and advisors arrived alongside shipments of oil and machinery. U.S. intelligence analysts warned that Cuba was slipping into the Soviet orbit. The language in official memos grew sharper, a hostile power now entrenched just 90 miles from American soil. The proximity was impossible to ignore. Florida's beaches faced a new neighbor, one aligned with America's greatest adversary. In Washington, the sense of threat was immediate and visceral. The Cold War, once measured in continents and oceans, had moved to America's doorstep. Every decision from this point forward would be shaped by the fear that the next confrontation might begin not in Berlin or Korea, but in Cuba, close enough to see on a clear day. Before dawn on April 17, 1961, a fleet of boats crept toward the southern coast of Cuba. On board were roughly 1,400 men, Cuban exiles, trained by the CYA, hoping to reclaim their homeland from Castro's government. The plan was simple on paper. Land at the Bay of Pigs, secure a foothold, spark a popular uprising, and topple the regime. But almost from the first moment, nothing went as intended. The operation hinged on surprise and on air support. The first airstrikes, meant to cripple Cuba's small air force, had only limited effect. Hours before the main landing, a second wave of bombers was called off in Washington. The decision left the exile brigade exposed. Cuban pilots, still able to fly, strafed the invasion beaches and sank supply ships offshore. On land, the exiles met fierce resistance. Castro's forces, forewarned and well-armed, pushed the invaders back into the swamps. Radio broadcasts announced the attack as it unfolded, rallying local militias and spreading confusion among the attackers. There was no general uprising. Reinforcements never arrived. By the third day, the beachhead had collapsed. More than 100 exiles were killed. Around 1,200 surrendered and were taken prisoner. The promise of a swift victory turned into a public disaster. In Washington, the sense of crisis deepened. The failure at the Bay of Pigs did not solve the problem of Cuba. It made it more urgent and far more dangerous. After the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedy administration turned to shadows. The failure on the beaches of Cuba did not end the drive to unseat Castro. It only changed the methods. In November 1961, Operation Mongoose was born, a campaign of sabotage, propaganda, and relentless pressure, all kept far from public view. The mission was sweeping to disrupt Cuba's economy, spark unrest, and shatter the regime's hold from within. Saboteurs targeted power plants and sugar mills. Propaganda teams flooded the island with leaflets and rumors. Agents plotted to poison crops, destroy infrastructure, and even assassinate key figures. Each scheme was more desperate than the last. Edward Lansdale, a veteran of psychological warfare, was placed in charge of this effort. Operating from a suite in the Pentagon, Lansdale coordinated dozens of covert actions. His staff called it the Cuba Project. But for all its scope, Mongoose could not break Castro's grip. The regime survived every plot. Soviet support deepened. The world watched for any sign of open American intervention, but the law stood in the way. U.S. legal advisors warned that an outright invasion required clear justification, something Congress and the public would accept. Without a convincing cause, any attack risked global condemnation and even war with the Soviet Union. Inside the Pentagon, frustration hardened into something more dangerous, a search for pretext. The challenge was no longer just how to defeat Castro, but how to justify it. Within this climate, the boundaries between covert action and open conflict began to blur. The next proposal would cross a line that few in Washington had imagined possible. On March 13, 1962, a memorandum left the inner offices of the Pentagon. Its title, stamped in bold at the top of the first page, read, "Justification for United States Military Intervention in Cuba." This was not a stray draft or a whispered suggestion. The document bore the signature of General Lyman Lemnitzer, the highest-ranking officer in the United States military, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The memo was addressed directly to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Its journey followed the strict protocols of the Pentagon, logged, routed, and recorded. A cover letter, routing slips, and a chain of custody marked each hand it passed through. The memorandum originated from the staff of the Joint Chiefs, within the framework of the Cuba Project, known in classified circles as Operation Mongoose. Every step in its preparation and transmission was by the book, designed to ensure that the proposal reached the most senior levels of government. General Lemnitzer's signature carried the full weight of military authority. His career stretched back to West Point, class of 1920. He had earned the Silver Star as a commander in Korea and had risen through the ranks to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs in 1960. By 1962, Lemnitzer was the principal military advisor to the president, trusted with the nation's most sensitive plans. His endorsement meant this was not the work of a rogue faction or a handful of extremists. The proposal reflected the institutional thinking of the Pentagon's top leadership. The memorandum did not hide in the shadows. It was classified top secret, but it was meant to be seen by the Secretary of Defense and, in time, the President. The paperwork was meticulous. Transmittal logs, acknowledgement receipts, and annexes accompanied the main document. The proposal moved through official channels, following the established hierarchy from the Joint Chiefs staff to McNamara's office. This was not rumor. This was not the stuff of conspiracy. The Northwoods Memorandum was a formal documented proposal, fully integrated into the machinery of national security decision-making. Its existence, its routing, and its signatory left no doubt the plan was real and it demanded to be taken seriously. The Northwoods Memorandum, marked top secret and routed through the upper echelons of the Pentagon, set out its proposals in the measured language of military planning. Each scenario was described with the calm detachment of a standard report, but the substance beneath the words was anything but ordinary. One proposal called for simulated attacks on American military installations. The memorandum detailed plans to blow up ammunition depots at Guantanamo Bay, sabotage grounded aircraft, and ignite fuel tanks. A U.S. Navy ship, moored in the harbor, would be damaged or sunk. The aftermath would include staged funerals, complete with grieving families and flag-draped coffins. Every detail was designed to point the blame at Cuban agents. Another scenario involved the sinking of a boat carrying Cuban refugees bound for Florida. The victims would be selected to appear as civilians escaping Castro's regime. The sinking would be staged as a deliberate act by Cuban forces, with fake distress calls broadcast over open radio frequencies. News outlets would report the loss of innocent lives at sea, with Havana held responsible. The memorandum also described a plan for a fake Cuban Air Force attack on a civilian airliner. A drone, painted to resemble a passenger jet, would fly a route near Cuba. At a predetermined point, the plane would be destroyed, and the incident would be presented as proof of Cuban aggression against American civilians. The plan included instructions for substituting the drone for a real aircraft and fabricating passenger lists to support the story. Bombings in American cities were considered as well. The document proposed placing explosives in Miami, Key West, and Washington, D.C. The targets would be public spaces, chosen to maximize fear and disruption. Undercover operatives, posing as Cuban agents, would carry out the attacks. The resulting terror would be used to rally support for military intervention. There were suggestions to assassinate prominent anti-Castro Cuban exiles inside the United States. These deaths would be blamed on Cuban operatives, transforming the victims into martyrs and fueling outrage among the exile community. The memorandum described these actions as necessary to create a credible threat from Cuba. One of the most startling proposals involved the American space program. If John Glenn's historic orbital flight ended in disaster, the memorandum suggested blaming the tragedy on Cuban sabotage. The loss of a national hero would become another pretext for intervention, with responsibility laid at Castro's feet. Throughout the document, the language remained clinical. Each scenario was presented as a logical step toward creating a justification for war. Civilian casualties, media manipulation, and public panic were treated as operational details, not moral dilemmas. Every proposal shared one goal: to manufacture outrage, create the appearance of unprovoked Cuban aggression, and provide the president with political cover for a full-scale invasion. The memorandum did not question the morality of these actions. It asked only if they could be carried out without exposure. The Northwoods Memorandum was not the work of outsiders. It was drafted, reviewed, and signed by the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. military and delivered to the Secretary of Defense. The signature at the bottom belonged to General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Its existence is a matter of record, and its proposals force a reckoning with the boundaries of power and responsibility. Robert McNamara received the Northwoods Memorandum through the official channels of the Pentagon. The paper trail was clear. Routing slips, signatures, and cover letters placed the proposal squarely on the Secretary of Defense's desk. There was no ambiguity, no deniability. The plan had the full endorsement of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by General Lyman Lemnitzer. McNamara reviewed the document and brought it to President Kennedy. On March 16, 1962, in the Oval Office, the nation's highest civilian leaders confronted the stark reality of what was being proposed. Kennedy listened as the scenarios were outlined: staged attacks, fake casualties, manufactured outrage. The president's response was immediate and final. He rejected the plan. There would be no authorization, no secret order, no green light for deception or violence against American citizens. The proposal stopped at the highest level of civilian authority. Operation Northwoods was never implemented. The paper remained in the files, stamped top secret, its pages a record of how far military planning had gone and where it had been halted. In the months that followed, Lemnitzer's approach no longer matched the direction of White House policy. He was reassigned from the Pentagon, first to command U.S. forces in Europe, then to the role of Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. The episode stands as a clear demonstration of civilian control over the military. Even in an era of deep fear and uncertainty, with the Cold War pressing in and Cuba aligned with Moscow, the constitutional order held. The line was drawn not by generals, but by elected leaders. Operation Northwoods never became policy. The danger was stopped not by accident, but by decision. For nearly 40 years, the Northwoods Memorandum gathered dust in locked cabinets, its pages stamped top secret and sealed away from public scrutiny. Only a small circle of officials knew what had been proposed, and the paper trail disappeared into the vast archives of the Pentagon and the National Security Council. The story might have ended there, buried by time and bureaucracy, if not for the slow churn of declassification. In the early 2000s, the document re-emerged, not as rumor or hearsay, but as a facsimile stamped with the signatures of the Joint Chiefs, routed through official channels, and preserved in government records. The National Security Archive, a nonprofit dedicated to uncovering government records, obtained the Northwoods memo through a Freedom of Information Act request. In 2001, the full text was published online, accompanied by the original routing slips and cover letters. The following year, the JFK Assassination Records Review Board released additional files, including the transmittal logs and annexes, confirming the memo's authenticity. Public attention surged when James Bamford's book, Body of Secrets, featured the Northwoods Plan as a case study in Cold War brinkmanship. News outlets picked up the story, and historians pored over the details. For the first time, the American public could see the proposals in their own words, no longer the subject of speculation, but a matter of documented fact. The release of Northwoods forced a reckoning. What had once been hidden in the shadows of national security was now open to debate, analysis, and accountability. Historians now treat the Northwoods Memorandum as a primary source, evidence of how far Cold War anxiety could push the boundaries of official planning. The document sits at the heart of academic debates about the era, not as a rumor, but as a record stamped with the signatures of the nation's top military officers. Some see Northwoods as proof of institutional overreach, a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority when fear overrides restraint. Others point to its ultimate rejection as a sign that democratic safeguards can work, even under the most intense pressure. The enduring lesson is not found in the rejected operations themselves, but in the climate that made such proposals imaginable. Northwoods stands as a reminder that fear, left unchallenged, can make the unthinkable seem reasonable inside a democracy, and that oversight, transparency, and civilian control are not abstractions, but essential defenses against the normalization of extreme measures. This was no rumor. These words, signed and stamped, crossed the highest desks in Washington. Operation Northwoods was rejected, but the machinery that produced it remains. Even now, fear can make the unthinkable seem necessary. In every democracy, the line between defense and deception is drawn by those willing to say no. That line must be guarded, every generation, every crisis. What would you do if the document landed on your desk?